2. Introduction. To grow with time is an inherent property of all forms of life. Study of population growth is at the core of applied ecology. It informs about the abundance or rarity of population with time, which in turn determines the structure of community in an ecosystem. Depending on the size of organisms and their reproductive potentials, a population may grow in size from every minute, hour, days. Bacteria and viruses and protozoans, months or seasons. Insects, fish and birds, or once in several years. Elephants and flowering plants like bamboo. Bamboo lives for 100 to 120 years before the produce seeds and die. Figure 1. Reproductive potential of organisms. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. 3. The maximum reproductive potential under unlimited environmental resources conditions is known as biotic potential. Chapman 1928. Maximum reproductive rate denoted as Rmax is observed only under unlimited environmental conditions to which there is always an environmental resistance. An unlimited growth of a population is calculated from its reproductive potential. Biotic potential is never observed in nature. For example, the slowest breeding animal like elephant, a single pair would have over 19 million descendants alive after 750 years. A single pair of houseflies with lifespan of 14 to 30 days, each female can lay 9,000 eggs in its lifespan in batches of 500. Thus in 7 generations a single pair would produce 6 trillion houseflies per year. A single oyster can produce 55 to 114 million eggs. In nature no population reproduces as per its biotic potential since all the resources are not unlimited. As is clear from the above example, if given an opportunity with the biotic potential, the whole land will be occupied only by a few species and the biodiversity will be lost. It can easily be visualized from the following example of paramecium population colonized from a single cell within 6 days. Figure 2. A population growth of paramecium from a single cell in 6 days. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. 4. Figure 2b. Human population growth. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. Populations have a characteristic pattern of increase known as the growth forms. 2 basic patterns are described on the basis of the shape of the growth curve, namely J-shaped or exponential growth form, S, or sigmoid-shaped or logistic growth form. These 2 forms can be combined or modified or both in various ways depending on the characteristics of a population and environmental conditions. Following are the 2 growth forms of the populations. 1. Exponential growth. 2. Logistic growth. 3. Exponential population growth. Exponential growth of a population was noted for the first time by Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766-1834, an economist. In 1798, he published his essay on Principles of Population, in which he proposed that the populations tend to increase faster than the means of their subsistence. He proposed that the populations increase in geometrical 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on, whereas their food increases arithmetical 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on progression. Using an exponential form of population growth, 2 fruit flies could produce enough offspring to fill the space between the Earth and the Sun in only 1 year, if all of the offspring survived. Exponential growth is one of 2 growth rates ecologists recognize in nature, but there are many other factors that keep the world from becoming 5. Overrun with any one population, may it be fruit flies or other organisms that show exponential growth. Figure 3. Malthusian growth. Source. CC. 3.1. Semelparous and Iteroparous reproductive strategies. The reproductive strategy of an organism can either be semelparous or iteroparous. Semelparous. A semelparous species reproduces only once before it dies. A delay in the breeding season may exert a regulative effect on their population growth. If the adults breeding in one season rarely or never survive to breed in the next, has an important effect on their dynamics. In discrete breeding species, the population may breed only once at a specific time of the year. The word semelparity comes from the Latin word semel, once or single time, and word perio, to beget, and was coined by evolutionary biologist Lamont Cole. As the single reproductive event of semelparous organisms is usually large as well as fatal, it is considered by some as Big Bang reproduction. Pacific salmon, Oncorhynchus spp. is a classic example of a semelparous organism which lives for many years in the ocean before swimming to the freshwater stream of its birth, spawning, and dying. Other semelparous animals include some species of butterflies, cicadas, and mayflies, many arachnids, and some mollusks such as some species of squid and octopus. In plant kingdom, an annual is a plant that completes its life cycle in a single season, and is usually semelparous. 6. Figure 4a. Pacific salmon is an example of a semelparous organism. Source. File. Oncorhynchus_nerca_2.jpgcc. Iteroparous can reproduce more than once in its lifetime. The term iteroparity comes from the Latin itero, to repeat, and perio, to beget. Thus, there is two or more overlapping generation of organisms living at any one time. In other words, one generation of young individuals coexist with one older generation in reproductively active state. Human is example of an iteroperous organism, as humans are biologically capable of having offspring many times over the course of their lives. Iteroperous vertebrates include most fishes and reptiles, all birds and all mammals. Among invertebrates, most mollusca and many insects, for example, mosquitoes and cockroaches, are iteroperous. Most perennial plants are iteroperous. Figure 4b. The pig is an example of an iteroperous organism. Source. File. So_with_piglet. JPG-CC. 7. 3.2 Exponential population growth in Semelparous species. In Semelparous life history, birth rate and the density of the organisms plays an important role in determining the growth pattern. A. Multiplication rate remains constant, RO. Net reproductive rate or birth rate remains constant, B. Multiplication rate depends on population size, density dependent. A. Multiplication rate remains constant. Consider a species with a single annual breeding season and a lifespan of 1 year. Let each female produce RO female offspring on the average, that survive to breed the following year, then population numbers n in generations t equals 0, 1, 2 is equal to nt plus 1 equals RO nt. Nt, population size of females at age time t. Nt plus 1, population size at the time t plus 1. RO, net reproductive rate, is the number of female offspring produced per female per generation when t is large. Then this equation can be approximated by an exponential function. Table 1. Population growth of a hypothetical population with constant multiplication rate. Figure 5. Hypothetical exponential population growth. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. A change in the RO results in a change in the shape of the growth curve, as it is clear from the Fig 6. An increase in the net reproductive rate increases the population more rapidly. Figure 6. Example. Starting population. As the value of RO. Change in the slope of the curve. Source. 9. The multiplication rate changes with the change in the population density. The multiplication rate changes with the change in the population density. Figure 5. Hypothetical. Source. A change in the R. Figure 6. Example. Starting. As the value of RO increases, the population size increases more rapidly. Change in the slope of the curve. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. Kreb. B. Multiplication rate depends on population size, density. Populations normally do not grow with a constant multiplication rate. If we look at the trajectory turnover of a species population through time, a variety of dynamics is observed in populations, such as small fluctuations, chaotic fluctuations, or cyclical oscillations. 9. The multiplication rate changes with the change in the population density. At high density, birth rate decreases or death rate increases due to several factors such as epidemics, predation, or shortage of resources. At low densities, birth rate increases and death rate decreases due to less parasitic and predatory attacks and sufficient of resource availability, resulting in fluctuations, oscillations, or decline of the population. This can be simply expressed in mathematical model showing a linear relationship between population density n on x-axis and net reproductive rate R0 on y-axis. Figure 7. Net reproductive rate is a linear function of population density in this hypothetical data equilibrium. Density is 100. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. The point where line crosses RO equals 1 is a point of equilibrium in the population density. At this point, birth rate equals the death rate. How to measure population density from this curve? It is measured in terms of deviation from the equilibrium point by the following formula. C equals NNEQ, where C equals is the deviation from the equilibrium density, N equals observed population density. NEQ equals equilibrium population size when R0 is equals 1, R0 equals 1.0-B NNEQ. This shows equation of a straight line. 10 equals 1 BZ. B equals slope of the line. (13) It can be concluded that A. An equilibrium state is observed if L is between 0 to 1. B. Convergent oscillations are seen if L is between 1 and 2, Fig 8a circa. Indefinite stable oscillations result if L is between 2 to 2.57, Fig 8b. D. When the value of L approaches more than 2.57, populations fluctuate in a chaotic manner. Figure 8c. 4. R and K. Reproductive strategies in population. K. Selected populations live under more predictable environment. They are subjected to density-related mortality, spend less energy on reproduction, favors efficient use of environment. Population growth is sigmoid-shaped based on Verhulst-Pearl logistic equation. In R, selected populations live under more harsh conditions and show exponential population growth. After attaining their maximum size may show a decline or complete population crash because the resources are completely exhausted. Table 6. Differences between R and K selection species. Parameters: R, selection; K, selection. Climate conditions: variable and unpredictable, uncertain, fairly constant and predictable. Mortality reasons: often catastrophic, more directed survivorship curves, mostly type 3, usually types I, and 2 population size. 1. Variable in time. 2. Non-equilibrium, well below carrying capacity of environment. 3. Unsaturated communities or portions thereof, ecologic vacuums. 4. Fast recolonization. 1. Fairly constant in time. 2. Equilibrium, at or near carrying capacity saturated communities. 3. No recolonization. Intrond interspecific competition: variable, often negligent, lacks, usually intense, keen. Selection favors: 1. Rapid development. 2. High R max. 3. Early reproduction. 4. Small body size. 5. Single reproduction, Semelparus. 1. Slower development. 2. Greater competitive ability. 3. Delayed reproduction. 4. Larger body size. 5. Repeated reproduction, Oedipus. 6. Many small offspring. 6. Fewer larger progeny, length of life short, usually less than a year, longer, usually more than a year, stage in succession, early, late, climax. 5. Summary. To grow and sustain themselves in an ecosystem is an inherent property all populations. The population growth is a result of addition of new individuals through natality and by immigrations, and their decline is by mortality and emigration. The difference between these two parameters, natality and mortality, is given as instantaneous rate R of population increase. Malthus proposed that the populations increase in geometrical 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on, whereas their food increases arithmetical 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on progression. When the environmental conditions are unlimiting, the populations expand geometrically or exponentially. It is observed in small populations entering into a new vacant habitat. Exponential growth, also known as Malthusian growth, is characterized by constant birth and death rate, intrinsic rate of increase, and a stable age distribution maintained indefinitely. A species is considered Semelparous when it reproduces only a single time before it dies. Populations with Semelparous life history can have constant multiplication rate R. Multiplication rate depends on population size, density dependent. Net reproductive rate is a linear function of population density at equilibrium density NQ. dN dt is 0 and R net reproductive rate is 1. Oedipus species can reproduce more than once in its lifetime. Thus there are 2 or more overlapping generation of organisms living at any one time. In R, selected populations that show exponential population growth after attaining their maximum size may show a decline or complete population crash because the resources are completely exhausted. L is multiple of equilibrium density and slope of the curve. The value of L determines the behavior of the population, whether it converges towards equilibrium or show oscillations or fluctuations. 14. One of the important attribute of a population is to grow with time for the sustainability of a species and ecosystem balance. Depending on the size and reproductive strategies of organisms, a population may grow in size from every minute, hour, days, bacteria and viruses and protozoans, months or seasons, insects, fish and birds. The populations with long lifespan may breed once in several years, elephants and flowering plants like bamboo. As discussed in part 1 of population growth, 2 types of reproductive strategies observed in nature are Semelparous and Oedipus. Oedipus populations can reproduce continuously in their reproductive phase and have overlapping reproductive generations. These populations have characteristic patterns of increase known as the growth forms. On the basis of the shape of the growth curve, they are called 1. J, shaped or exponential growth form. 2. S, or sigmoid-shaped or logistic growth form. These 2 forms can be combined or modified in various ways depending on the characteristics of a population and environmental conditions. In part 1 of population growth, you have learned about the exponential growth in Semelparous organism. The growth rate in these populations can be with constant multiplication rate or depends on their density. Whereas in Oedipus populations, since there are overlapping generations, exponential population growth is like an increase in compound interest. 3. Exponential population growth in Oedipus populations. Oedipus organisms can reproduce more than once in their lifetime. The population is divided into two generations, old and young, even though ecologists divide them into three age classes with respect to reproduction, such as pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive. In these population where old and young individuals both are reproductively active, it is called overlapping generation. Sometimes there can be even more than one overlapping generations in Iteroperous organisms if a species has a long lifespan with a long reproductive age. In other words, one generation of young individuals coexist with one or more older generation in reproductively active state in overlapping generations, whereas, in non-overlapping generation, a new generation replaces older one. In Iteroperous life history, the population growth depends on the geometric growth factor R. Geometric growth is also known as fundamental net reproductive rate. It is the factor by which an individual multiplies itself over the time, and it can be calculated from the difference in the birth and death rate per year. It is given as R equals 1 plus BD. As the fundamental net reproductive rate is nearly stable for a population under constant ecological conditions and in the absence of other disturbances, it can be applied in rehabilitation of an endangered species. This has been used by the government for the protection of tigers in wildlife sanctuary away from the human settlement area. All the factors that disturb the intrinsic rate of growth are eliminated and food is provided in the unlimited quantities. Special care is taken during mating period in November and April. Gestation period for tigers is nearly 4 months. If the population starts with 50 tigers and number of birth per year of the population from which the tigers were obtained was 0.45 and number of death per year was 0.1, then the R value will be 1 plus 0.45 minus 0.1 equals 1.35. If 5. NT equals RT. NO. In the populations that have overlapping generations and prolonged and continuous breeding seasons, the population growth can be described more easily by the use of differential equations. They never depend on parameters like season, food, or climate for breeding. The population increase depends on instantaneous per capita rate of growth. It can be described in terms of rate of population size change. dN dt equals Rn. In this equation, R is the instantaneous per capita rate of growth, and it can be calculated by the following equation. 3.1 Assumptions of exponential model. 1. Continuous reproduction, that is, there is no seasonality. 2. All organisms are identical and populations do not show age structure. 3. Environment is constant in space and time and the resources are unlimited. 4. There is no movement of individuals into and out of the population. 3.2 Exponential growth equation. However, exponential model is robust. It gives reasonable precision even if these conditions do not meet. Organisms may differ in their age, survival, and mortality. But the population consists of a large number of organisms, and thus their birth and death rates are averaged. Parameter R in the exponential model can be interpreted as a difference between the birth reproduction rate and the death rate. dN dt equals B minus dN equals Rn. Or dN dt equals B minus Mn equals Rn. Where B is the birth rate and M can be substituted by D in this equation, is the death rate. Birth rate is the number of offspring organisms produced per existing organism in the population per unit time. Death rate is the probability of dying per one organism. The rate of population growth, R, depends on the difference between birth and death rate. 6. It is very important to understand that R measures population change in absolute units of time, e.g., years, whereas R0 measures population change in terms of generation time. To convert R0 into R, we must first calculate generation time, G, and then adjust R0. Generation time is calculated as T or G equals sigma bx, Lx, XRO. R equals log arrow G. The geometrical growth curves, also called exponential growth curves, mostly end in the population crashes or population explosion. The death of the individuals occurs due to any one of the following factors when the population increases beyond a certain number: due to starvation, disease, or competition. In other words, it is due to the environmental resistance to population increase. The population growth curve can be J-shaped or dome-shaped. The exponential growth curves are obtained when there is no movement of individuals into and out of the population. Under unlimited conditions, the equation is derived as dN dt equals Rn. R equals dN dTn. Intrinsic rate of growth can be calculated if change in population over a given period of time is known. Parameter R is called as any one of the following and is different from R in the previous equation. Malthusian parameter and is expressed as Rm, m, the maximum contribution per female to population growth. Intrinsic rate of increase. Instantaneous rate of natural increase. Population growth rate. Instantaneous rate of natural increase and population growth rate are generic terms because they do not imply any relationship to population density. It is better to use the term intrinsic rate of increase for parameter R in the logistic model rather than in the exponential model, because in the logistic model, R equals to the population growth rate even at very low density, no environmental resistance. In the integrated form it is given as NT equals no t. NT is the number of individuals at time t, NO is number of individuals at time 0, starting population size. Under these conditions the population growth simulates the compound interest as follows. A equals P, 1 plus R, N. A is the amount at a given time, like NT for population. P is the original amount or the principal, like no. R is the rate of interest, like intrinsic rate of population increase. N is the number of years given as T time units for population growth. If the interest is compounded several times a year, the equation is given as A equals P, 1 plus R Q, NQ. Where Q is the number of times the interest is compounded. During a year, if interest is compounded continuously, then Q approaches infinity. If RQ is equals X, then the equation can be given as then A equals P, 1 plus X N R X. Q equals R X. When Q approaches infinity, X approaches 0. A equals P, 1 plus X I slash X dot NR. Since 1 plus X 3.3 Applications and examples of exponential growth. Microbiology, growth of bacteria. Conservation biology, restoration of disturbed populations. Prediction of yield, useful insect rearing, animal husbandry. Plant or insect quarantine, population growth of introduced or exotic species, aquaculture, fishery, prediction of fish dynamics. Example 1. Graph showing the geometrical exponential growth of phlox plant. As indicated, the number of plants can be calculated at any time interval by using equation NT equals no t. Figure 10. Geometrical exponential growth of phlox plant. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. In Figure 11, exponential growth of the hypothetical populations with starting population of 10 individuals and with differing values of net reproductive rate R. It clearly indicates the increasing slope with the increasing value of RO. At 0 net reproductive rate, the population is stable constant. Figure 11. Examples of population with overlapping generations. Starting population is 10. Population growth is plotted on a semilogarithmic scale with natural base, E, with constant value 2.71828, x-axis 0 to 100 and y-axis natural log from 0 to 5. Source. Author and ILLL in-house Peter Stilling. 9. 10. Example 2. Lion-tailed monkey. The lion-tailed macaque Macacasalinus is an old world monkey that is endemic to the western Ghats of South India. It primarily feeds on indigenous fruits, leaves, buds, insects and small vertebrates in virgin forest. These animals are disappearing due to loss of habitat. Gestation period is approximately 6 months. The young are nursed in the first year. Sexual maturity is reached at 4 years for females, 6 years for males. The life expectancy in the wild is approximately 20 years. The human settlement is withdrawn from a small area in the western Ghats and the forest begin to grow rapidly. Slowly the number of trees, insects and small vertebrates have began to increase. One such study suggests that 102 lion-tailed monkeys found their way into this ideal place of growth, and the growth of the lion-tailed monkeys was as follows. Table 3. In this study from the Western Ghat Forest, the data states that the rate of monkey population growth, 19,721,997, is equals 355 to 102, 25 equals 10.12. Since the growth is given as per capita, it is divided by 102, population taken approximately 110.2, 100 equals 0.1012. D and dt equals Rn. On integrating. Nt equals N0 Population growth is an index that indicates how common or rare a species is, which in turn affects the amount rate of population harvest. Like, how many fish will be there after a period of trawling? How many trees can be cut from the population, ensuring the same growth of the tree population? It is also important to protect the endangered species. This can be easily done by calculating their growth rate under unlimited environmental conditions. The resources can be utilized without loss of a species and protect the threatened species. This is especially useful in control of the expanding population. Thus, though continuous or discrete mode of population growth is a very rare event, and it has its own importance in predicting the behavior of a population. 3.4 Trends in human population growth. If we interpret a data from the recent past for the human population, there was a slow rate for nearly 174 years, 1800–1974. Population increased from 1 billion to 2 billion in 127 years, whereas it took only 13 years to increase by 1 billion, 4 to 5 billion, from 1874 to 1887. Presently, the world population growth rate has decreased as 12 years are required to increase 1 billion people, and by 2043, nearly 40 years would be required for 1 billion increase in population size. Table 4. (13) 4. Logistic growth. The geometric or exponential growth of all populations is eventually curtailed by food availability, competition for other resources, predation, disease, and many other ecological factors, resulting in population crash and complete disappearance of the population. But it is observed that population is not completely removed and they are sustained for a long time in a balanced ecosystem. 4.1. Verhulst-Pearl equation. In 1938, Verhulst, Pierre-François Verhulst, 1804–1849, proposed that the populations grow in a much more systematic way than is proposed by Malthus. Growth pattern depends on the carrying capacity of a resource as well as the number of individuals, value of n, at any given time. The growth is limited by resources as it gets consumed by the growing population n, such as food, and the exponential growth of the population begins to slow down. The competition for all resources increases with the increase in population with the increase in density, and the growth rate eventually approaches to zero near the carrying capacity K for the environment and shows a plateau. This results in an S or sigmoid-shaped curve of population growth. It is also known as the logistic growth curve and can be plotted by applying the logistic growth equation. The logistic growth equation was independently proposed by Verhulst and Pearl, therefore it is named as Verhulst-Pearl growth equation as given below. dN dt equals Rn K minus N. K, rate of population increase, equals rate of pop growth per capita x population size x unutilized opportunity for the population growth. Or the equation can be written as dN dt equals Rn1 minus Nk, where dN dt equals rate of increase of the population, R equals rate of pop growth per capita, N equals the number of individuals of the population at the time, t. K equals it is the constant upper limit of the population growth and is known as the carrying capacity of a place. It indicates the number of individuals that can be supported by a resource at which dN dt equal to 0. Table 5. A hypothetical example to explain the unutilized resource opportunity for population increase. 14. K equals 1. dt equals Rn K minus K. 4.2 Sigmoid growth curve. The curve plotted on the basis of Verhulst-Pearl equation is sigmoid-shaped. This indicates that the population at a new place habitat initially grows very slowly, and after attaining a certain number its rate of increase is exponential. When it is approaching the state of equilibrium, the carrying capacity, it again slows down and becomes constant parallel to the x-axis. This parallel line is known as asymptote and is the state of equilibrium, demarcating the carrying capacity of the resource. Carrying capacity is the total amount of resource, which may be space or food, sum total of all its requirements for its growth for a population. On the graph it is indicated as the asymptote K. Populations initiated at densities above K decline exponentially until they reach K, which represents the state of stable equilibrium. From Pionka, 2000. Figure 13. Components of sigmoid population growth plotted on the basis of Verhulst-Pearl logistic equation. The upper limit termed is the carrying capacity K or asymptote. Populations initiated at densities above K decline exponentially until they reach back K. From Pionka. 2000. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. Since the populations are dynamic, they show oscillations or fluctuations around the asymptote. Oscillations are regular changes, whereas fluctuations are irregular or erratic changes in the population size. The terms Rn, Nk represent the density-dependent reduction in the rate of population growth. Thus, at n equal to unity, an ecologic vacuum dN dt is nearly exponential, whereas at n equal to k, dN dt is 0 and the population is in a steady state at its carrying capacity. Logistic equations. There are many more besides the Verhulst-Pearl equation, generate sigmoid-shaped population growth curves. 15. 4.3. Assumptions of the logistic equation. 1. There is a stable age distribution initially. 2. Each individual is equivalent to all of the other individuals in the population, that is, the addition of every new individual reduces the actual rate of increase by the same fraction, 1k, at all density. 3. Time lag, that is a delay in the environmental change on the population growth, are unimportant. 4. No threshold phenomenon is associated with the response to approaching k. 5. All individuals are equivalent. 4. 3. 2. 1. Assumption. 4. 4.3. Assumptions of the logistic equation. 1. There is a stable age distribution initially. 2. Each individual is equivalent to all of the other individuals in the population, that is, the addition of every new individual reduces the actual rate of increase by the same fraction, 1k, at all density. 3. Time lag, that is a delay in the environmental change on the population growth, are unimportant. 4. No threshold phenomenon is associated with the response to approaching k. 5. All individuals are equivalent, R max and k, are immutable constants. 6. There is no time lag in the response of the actual rate of increase per individual to changes in n in natural populations. These assumptions are rarely met with due to diversity of organisms in a population and complexity of community in an ecosystem. However, simple and small organisms under laboratory conditions grow according to the logistic equation. 4.4. The falsification of these assumptions is 1. Each female contributes differently to the population growth, which may be due to the difference in their growth rate, that is the time to reach maturity and the number of offspring produced. 2. Rapidity and intensity of the response of the population growth, either the mortality rate and or the birth rate to changes in the environmental conditions, determine how closely the population number will approach towards stabilizing at the carrying capacity. Any delay in response to growth rate to fluctuations in population size will lead to oscillations about the carrying capacity. The magnitude of oscillations increases, the lag period also increases. Long lag time might lead to extinction. 3. Carrying capacity does not remain constant in time, e.g. birds feeding seasonal crop seeds show seasonal variations in their growth pattern. 4. For human population, technology plays an important role in the dynamics of carrying capacity, e.g. Neolithic revolution increased the carrying capacity of the world through the invention of agriculture. Advances in technology are trying to keep pace with the increasing human demands and improving the carrying capacity of the Earth. Lester Brown of Earth Policy Institute has said that it would take 1.5 Earths to sustain our present level of consumption. Environmentally, the world is in an overshoot mode. 16. Figure 14. Exponential and sigmoid growth curves. Source. Author and ILLL in-house. The Fig 14 shows the two types of population growth curves based on exponential and logistic Verhulst-Pearl growth equation. At moderate population densities, sigmoid curve also shows exponential growth, whereas high and low densities there is slow rate of growth. 4.5 Example of sigmoid growth pattern. In the natural populations, the concept of carrying capacity can be demonstrated by the following example of caterpillar and wasp. The host caterpillar and parasite wasp eggs indicate the relationship between dn, dt, k and n. In the figure 14, a caterpillar Therintina leucocerae that lives in the tropical rainforests is completely covered with the cocoons of wasp. The adult wasp Glyptopantels lays eggs on the caterpillar when it is young, and the larval wasps eat the tissue of the growing caterpillar until they reach pupating size, at which time they emerge through the cuticle of the caterpillar's skin and form a cocoon. Here we have a situation that would seem to create a natural limit for the population density of the wasps. Maximum 80 cocoons can live on one caterpillar. Suppose there are 100 caterpillars in the environment. According to the logistic growth equation, there is a ceiling on the potential population density of the wasps at 100 x 80 equals 8,000. Thus the environment caterpillar for this species of wasp has a carrying capacity of 8,000. 17. Figure 15. Members of the genus Glyptopantels lay their eggs on the body of a caterpillar. Source. Population with very few individuals will have a lot of space left and will thus grow rapidly, whereas a population with many individuals will have less space left and will thus grow more slowly. The actual amount of space that remains available to the wasp population is 8,000 n, where n is the current population density of wasps. Thus the relative amount of space left will be 8,000 n, 8,000 divided by 8,000, because we wish to calculate the relative amount of space left, the proportion or percentage or each individual of what could be maximally available. 5. Summary. Iteroporous species can reproduce more than once in their lifetime. Thus there are two or more overlapping generation of organisms living at any one time. In iteroporous life history, the population growth depends on the geometric growth factor. Growth factor is the factor by which a quantity multiplies itself over time, or also called fundamental net reproductive rate. Geometric growth factor is obtained from the difference in the number of birth per year and the number of death per year. R equals 1 plus BD. Parameter R is called as any one of the following and is different from R Malthusian parameter and is expressed as Rm. M, the maximum contribution per female to population growth, intrinsic rate of increase or instantaneous rate of natural increase. 18. The environment is never stable. It limits the population growth with respect one or more than one factors, therefore the rate of growth is slowed down. It depends upon the carrying capacity K of the resource. Carrying capacity is the total amount of resource, which may be space or food, sum total of all its requirements for its growth for a population. On the graph it is indicated as the asymptote K. Verhulst and Pearl independently derived an equation explaining the sigmoid growth form of a population depending on the carrying capacity and the population size at any given time. Our selected species live in more unpredictable, harsh environmental conditions. Mortality is high and a greater amount of energy is spent on reproduction. They expand rapidly when the conditions are favorable. K. Selected populations live under more predictable environment. They are subjected density-related mortality, spend less energy on reproduction and favor efficient use of environment. Regular changes in the population density around the asymptote are called oscillations, and fluctuations are irregular or erratic changes in the population density around the carrying capacity K. Since the time of early Greeks it is mentioned in the natural history that there is balance of nature. The number of plants and animals are fixed and are at equilibrium in nature. Deviations from the equilibrium, as described in Bible, are a result of punishment sent by divine power. The actual theories of natural regulation of population were proposed by the biologist only after Darwin. It is observed that the population size of many species remains similar year after year with slight variations that are not significant. As already discussed in the population growth chapter, that the multiplication rate goes down as the population density increases, and a simple mathematical model is linear. At equilibrium population density, birth rate is equal to death rate. Rho equals O. The population growth rate is also density dependent. dN dt equals Rn K minus N. K, where K is the carrying capacity, N is the population size, and R is the intrinsic rate of increase. When the population growth reaches asymptote in a logistic growth curve, and dN dt is 0, it starts showing oscillations and fluctuations. Figure 1. Oscillations are cyclical changes around the asymptote and fluctuations are abrupt changes. Oscillations and fluctuations are These factors affect both types of population growth forms, but they are more applicable to the sigmoid growth forms, whereas in most of the populations with exponential growth, the population crashes when it reaches the asymptote. Figure 1. Population growth, fluctuations and oscillations around asymptote. Many populations show annual and seasonal variations in size. Invertebrate populations have more pronounced annual cycles of abundance and decline. Arctic mammals and birds show long-term cycles of abundance and scarcity depending on the season. Booms and busts of phytoplankton and zooplanktons are common in aquatic ecosystems. To understand whether a process is density dependent, it should be quantified. The vital rates, young ones per female, or seeds per plant, survivorship of larvae, etc., show a decrease with increasing density. In order to quantify the strength or severity of the density dependence, a commonly used method is K-value analysis. It is based on the killing power, also calculated for life tables, where K equals log initial density, final density, which is compared with log initial density. Initial and final density can be denoted, respectively, as B before and A after. Therefore, K equals log B, A equals log B, log A. The regulatory factors can be classified into the following types based upon whether they are within the same population, called intrinsic and extrinsic, if they are from outside the population like the environment, including other populations, population interactions, and abiotic factors. Another nomenclature to describe these factors can be abiotic and abiotic. A. Extrinsic mechanisms. These regulatory mechanisms are independent of population density and can lead to more drastic fluctuations in population. 4. B. Intrinsic mechanisms. They are also called auto-regulatory feedback mechanism or density-dependent factors, as they are influenced by the population density. All populations have a tendency to evolve towards self-regulatory mechanisms. Another way of classifying the population regulatory mechanisms is A. Biotic. Density-dependent and density-independent interspecific interactions mechanisms regulate population density in large ecosystems with high biodiversity. B. Abiotic. Physical and climatic. Thirdly, Peter Stilling has proposed a conceptual model to define population control, describing the factors which are more important in determining the mortality in a population. They are classified into two systems. A. Bottom-up factors, or trophodynamics. These are related to the food chain based on Lindemann, trophic dynamic model. This theory explains that the height of a trophic pyramid is the progressive attenuation of energy passing up the trophic levels from the producers through the primary consumers to secondary and tertiary. Since only 10% energy is transferred between successive levels, very little is left for the higher fourth or fifth trophic levels. This controls the population size. Growth, fluctuations and oscillations around asymptote. Many populations show annual and seasonal variations in size. Invertebrate populations have more pronounced annual cycles of abundance and decline. Arctic mammals and birds show long-term cycles of abundance and scarcity depending on the season. Booms and busts of phytoplankton and zooplanktons are common in aquatic ecosystems. To understand whether a process is density dependent, it should be quantified. The vital rates, young ones per female, or seeds per plant, survivorship of larvae, etc., show a decrease with increasing density. In order to quantify the strength or severity of the density dependence, a commonly used method is Kavalu analysis. It is based on the killing power, also calculated for life tables, where K equals log initial density, final density, which is compared with log initial density. Initial and final density can be denoted, respectively, as B before and A after. Therefore, K equals log B A equals log B log A. The regulatory factors can be classified into the following types based upon whether they are within the same population, called intrinsic and extrinsic, if they are from outside the population like the environment, including other populations, population interactions, and abiotic factors. Another nomenclature to describe these factors can be abiotic and abiotic. A. Extrinsic mechanisms. These regulatory mechanisms are independent of population density and can lead to more drastic fluctuations in population. 4. B. Intrinsic mechanisms. They are also called auto-regulatory feedback mechanism or density-dependent factors, as they are influenced by the population density. All populations have a tendency to evolve towards self-regulatory mechanisms. Another way of classifying the population regulatory mechanisms is A. Biotic. Density-dependent and density-independent interspecific interactions mechanisms regulate population density in large ecosystems with high biodiversity. B. Abiotic. Physical and climatic. Thirdly, Peter Stilling has proposed a conceptual model to define population control, describing the factors which are more important in determining the mortality in a population. They are classified into two systems. A. Bottom-up factors, or trophodynamics. These are related to the food chain based on Lindemann, Strophic dynamic model. This theory explains that the height of a trophic pyramid is the progressive attenuation of energy passing up the trophic levels from the producers through the primary consumers to secondary and tertiary. Since only 10% energy is transferred between successive levels, very little is left for the higher fourth or fifth trophic levels. This controls the population size. B. Top-down factors. Hairstone, Smith and Stobodkin, 1960, floated the idea that the Earth appears green because of the abundance of vegetation on it. There is a little impact of herbivores on them, as the population of herbivores is regulated by their predators, leading to their increased mortality, usually referred to as HSS theory. The number of predators is limited by prey or resource availability. This theory emphasizes the various types of mortalities on the different trophic levels in varied ecosystems. Laurie Oksanen named this hypothesis as ecosystem exploitation hypothesis, EEH. 3. Extrinsic mechanisms. I. Physical and climatic factors. E. Density-independent population interactions. E. Anthropogenic factors. IV. Diseases. 5. B. Predation and resource availability. 3.1. Physical and climatic factors. Ecosystems with low diversity and physically stressed are subjected to extrinsic perturbations. Populations tend to be regulated by physical components such as weather, water currents, chemical limiting factors, and pollution, etc. Among the extrinsic factors, the most important role is played by weather. Many seasonally breeding rodents and birds' population sizes increase under favorable weather condition. Kangaroo rat in deserts can withstand dry and arid conditions, but it reproduces in January after autumn rains. This is because rain stimulates the growth of herbaceous succulent plants that provide sufficient moisture and humid conditions required by kangaroo rat for reproduction. Similar behavior is observed in quails and weaver birds. Population growth rate increases during summer as long photoperiod and plenty of food is available for adults and their offspring. Weaver birds reproduce only during summer months when the days are long. Long photoperiod is required for the growth of testes and spermatogenesis in males. Laxmi Malhotra, et al. 1979. Populations of deer in the Adirondack Mountain, U.S., are sensitive to severe long winters of 50 to 60 days. The low-growing winter food gets buried in snow and is unavailable to fawn and adults. It results in more than 80% mortality of fawn. 3.2 Density-independent factors. There are positive, negative, and neutral effects of various population interactions which affect the population size at a given time. Mutualism and commensalism are positive interactions and lead to increase in population size, whereas predation, parasitism, competition, and amensalism are population declining interactions. 3.3. Anthropogenic factors. Human land use patterns drastically affect the habitat of all other organisms. Deforestation for urbanization, industrialization, and transport has made many wild animals homeless and curtailed their population growth rate. All types of pollutions and global warming have resulted in the unfavorable environment for many species and are leading to the reduction of wild species and even the extinction of some of them. Recent extinction of dodo and reduction in the number of vultures and sparrows from our vicinity are due to skyscraper buildings and electromagnetic waves produced by ICTs. 6. Primarily, it is the growing human population that is using most of the resources for itself and creating unsuitable habitat by manipulating the environment for its own comforts, without keeping in mind the requirements of other species' needs. 3.4. Diseases. Diseases help in regulating the population density around the asymptote. They can be both density dependent as well as density independent regulators of population. The environmental changes allow the growth of pathogens. Disease becomes an epidemic in high population density. As the population increases in size, there is an increased rate of spread of infectious disease, as well as certain parasites also. Rabies is a common disease of wild mammals. It is a viral disease highly contagious to humans. The virus follows the nerves from the infection point to the brain and spinal cord. The infected animals become excited, restless, exhibit convulsions and roam about aimlessly. They get paralyzed. Crater lion population in Ngorongoro Conservation Area, UNESCO World Heritage, Tanzania, showed density dependence at 100 individuals asymptote between 1962 and 1993. When the population became less than 100, it started growing, and with an increase above 100, it started declining. However, the crater population has remained below 60 individuals since 1994, even though prey abundance remained virtually unchanged. They suffered from a number of severe disease outbreaks over the past 50 years. Initially, the populations recovered, but 3 outbreaks between 1994 and 2001 occurred in such rapid succession that the population was unable to return to the carrying capacity. The crater lion population may have become unusually vulnerable to infectious disease in recent years owing to its close proximity to a growing human population and a history of close inbreeding. Unvaccinated domestic dogs are the most important reservoir for canine distemper virus. Inbreeding reduces the genetic diversity and efficiency of the mammalian immune response. Thus, the top predator of the Ngorongoro crater appears to have been regulated by top-down processes over the past 16 years. Greater competition leads to decreased number of offspring in the next generation. 3.5. Predation and resource availability. This is also an extrinsic population regulator, top-down processes. As the prey population size increases, its rate of predation increases since it is easily available. Prey is also one of the resources for predator. But at low prey density, predator changes its preferences for prey and moves to an alternative prey easily available to it, and the first prey gets time to recover its population size. Thus, prey population is regulated by predation at its high densities. 7. 4. Intrinsic mechanisms. The intrinsic control mechanism is basically intraspecific competition for common requirements and stress due to overcrowding. The competition is mainly for food, space and mate. It affects the carrying capacity of population, leading to leveling of population growth at high densities. At low densities, organisms do not compete for resource, whereas at higher densities resources may become limiting and the population size can no longer increase, resulting in sigmoid-shaped curve. A population, when regulated by the harmful effects parasites, predator or competition, it is called top-down process, whereas when it is regulated by limit in food supply, it is known as bottom-up process. Lions are subjected to both. 4.1. Effect of overcrowding. The main effect of overcrowding on a population is due to stress. That leads to endocrine imbalance in the body, affecting the growth and reproduction. K. Myers et al. Performed the experiments with Old World rabbit, Oryctologus cuniculus. They kept the rabbit at several different densities in different living places confined to their habitat. Rabbits living in the smallest spaces suffered the maximum. They were very aggressive, particularly the females. Reproduction declined. Kidney, spleen, adrenals and liver were greatly affected in their size and function. The young ones produced from them also showed stunted growth. On the other hand, rabbits from medium to low density showed excellent growth and survival. It has been observed in case of fish that there is a negative correlation between the density and the rate of body growth. Similarly, in bluegills, it is observed that in spite of the surplus food available, growth of the bluegills is reduced in size due to their high density in the lakes. Effect was studied by Christian as explained in the following flow diagram, figure 2. 8. Figure 2. Christian's stress hypothesis of population regulation. Figure 2. Christian hypothesis of population regulation. This mechanism can also be stated as feedback. Evidences suggest that overcrowding leads to stress that causes genetic changes and endocrine imbalance. The endocrine imbalance is mainly due to the LH, FSH, GH and ACTH of pituitary and adrenal catecholamines. It has been studied that in mice kept under laboratory conditions there is a delay in sexual maturity and suppression of somatic growth and impairment of reproductive function in males and females. R.L. Smith. Genetic change. Genetic feedback mechanism apparently operates through the density pressure, selection pressure and genetic change within the population. The changing environment of a place increases the density and also the viability of many individuals. As a result, many inferior genotypes survive. When the conditions become more rigorous, these ecologically weak genotypes are notable to survive and are eliminated. This reduces the population abruptly. Chitty 1960 studied this in vole population, and Wellington 1960 and 1964 observed the similar phenomenon in moth species. Carson in 1968 demonstrated the effect of genetic change on a laboratory population of Drosophila. 4.2. Effective competition. 4.2.1. There are two types of competition for food. 9. A. Scramble type. B. Contest type. A. Scramble competition. When the resource is not in short supply but at high population density, the access to the resource is obstructed and the resource is destroyed or wasted in the process. B. Contest competition. In this type of competition, the stronger individuals of the population consume the major share of the resource and the weaker individuals get insufficient amount for their survival. Nicholson 1954 performed a series of experiments to Nicholson 1954 performed a series of experiments to demonstrate the effect of food availability on the population density of adult and larval blowflies Lucilia cupurina. In his experiments, he reared a culture of blowflies containing both adult and larva. Separate food was used for both. Adults were given dry sugar and the larvae were fed on beef liver. Population of adults showed constant oscillations, figure 3. In the first experiment, there was sufficient food for both adult and larva. He provided surplus food for adults but limited constant food for larvae in the second experiment. In the third experiment, they reversed the conditions and provided constant daily quota food to the adults and surplus to the larvae. He found that the populations showed oscillations under all these conditions. Figure 3. Oscillations in numbers of adult sheep blowflies Lucilia cupurina, and in the daily rate of egg production in the laboratory population. Larvae received unlimited food, adults received limited supply. 0.5 grams of liver per day. Peaks in the adult cycle alternate with those in the egg cycle. 10. In a separate study, he demonstrated the scramble type of competition by compartmentalization of the food available to the blowflies. At high density, they scrambled the food and the population showed more severe oscillations with very high and very low number across the asymptote. Oscillations and fluctuations are observed in herbivorous and carnivorous species in the natural populations, especially when vegetation in a region shows seasonal variation. With the increase in plant growth, the herbivores increase in number. For details, see plant-herbivore interactions. Figure 4. Patelka hypothesis showing effect of food on population regulation. Four point two point two. Competition for space and mate. Social behavior. Social behavior in animals is in response to competition for space and mate. It may function in the regulation of their populations. Social interactions among individuals in a population involve agonistic or aggressive behavior. Dominance and territorial behaviors are a result of these interactions. In some populations, it may result in division of labor and colonial behavior. 11. A. Social dominance. Many animals live in social groups called flocks, herds, schools, or loose colonies. Many of these groups have a tendency to form social organization depending upon the intraspecific aggressiveness. Each individual occupies a position in the group based on the dominance and submissiveness, making a hierarchy called peck order. The most dominant individual is alpha. Next in hierarchy may be beta, subdominant, and omega peripheral. There may be simple linear, triangular, or a complex peck orders. Domestic chickens show a linear peck order. In the complex type of peck order, peck dominance may change depending upon the encounters. The individual that pecks the most is considered as the dominant one. Once the social hierarchy is established in a group, newcomers and subdominant rise in rank with great difficulty. The newcomers are rejected initially and they may remain a few yards behind the main group, as observed in quails. After a period of acquaintance, some may intermingle. Some may not be allowed in the breeding condition is very important in determining the social rank of individuals in a population. In male house finches, individuals which may be in the bottom of the hierarchy, but if they come into breeding condition first, they rise to the top. Hormones play an important role in determining the reproductive condition and aggressiveness. B. Territoriality. Territory is a more or less defended fixed area occupied by an individual or a social unit used for mainly feeding, mating, and nesting. Territorial behavior results in uniform dispersion of individuals over an area. It is found among insects, fish, bird, and some mammals. For the ecosystem balance and population regulation, the functions of territory are 1. Uniform dispersion of the organisms over an area. 2. To increase the individual fitness of the animals. Fitness in this biological sense relates to the ability of an animal to survive and raise young. The territories can be differentiated on the basis of their functions such as feeding, mating, singing of groups, and nesting. Ecologists have classified as 6 types of territories. Type 1. All-purpose territory. All types of activities occur in this, e.g., courtship, mating, nesting, and foraging, common in songbirds. For example, hummingbird uses it for feeding purpose. Type 2. Mating and nesting territory. Only the breeding activities takes place in the territory and most foraging occurs elsewhere, hawks and black-capped chickadees. 12. Type 3. Nesting territory. It includes the nest plus a small area around it, common in colonial water birds. Type 4. A pairing and mating territory. The type of territory defended by males in lekking species. E.g. lek of prairie grouse woodcock. Type 5. Roosting territory. Mostly in birds used for resting. Type 6. Winter territory. This typically includes foraging areas and roost sites. May be equivalent, in terms of location, to the Type 1 territory or for a migratory species, may be on the wintering grounds. The size and shape of a territory can vary according to its purpose, season, the amount and quality of resources it contains, or the geography. The size is usually a compromise of resource needs, defense costs, predation pressure, and reproductive needs. Some species of squirrels may claim as much as 10 hectares of territory. Spotted hyenas crocuta have highly variable territory sizes, ranging from less than 4,000 hectares in the Ngorongoro crater to over 100,000 hectares in the Kalahari. Type 3. Nesting territory. It includes the nest plus a small area around it, common in colonial water birds. Type 4. A pairing and mating territory. The size and shape of a territory can vary according to its purpose, season, the amount and quality of resources it contains, or the geography. The size is usually a compromise of resource needs, defense costs, predation pressure, and reproductive needs. Some species of squirrels may claim as much as 10 hectares of territory. Spotted hyenas crocuta have highly variable territory sizes, ranging from less than 4,000 hectares in the Ngorongoro crater to over 100,000 hectares in the Kalahari. Territory holders use aggressive behavior, including advertisement by scent, song, threat, roar, and attack to exclude intruders. One example is male ring-tailed lemurs have scent glands on their wrists, chests, and in the genital area, figure 5. During encounters with rival males, they may perform ritualized aggression by having a stink fight. The males anoint their tails by rubbing the ends of their tails on the inside of their wrists and on their chests. They then arch their tails over their bodies and wave them at their opponent. The male toward which this is directed either responds with a display of his own physical aggression or flees. Stink fights can last from 10 minutes to 1 hour. Figure 5. Ring-tailed lemurs hold their distinctive tails high in the air during territorial scent marking. They also engage in stink fights with intruding males. 13. C. Home range. Home range is an area in which an animal lives, performs all its activities, and is not aggressive. It is different from territory. Home range may or may not be defended partially or totally, and it may be overlapping with territory of other individuals. Generally, home range does not have a fixed boundary. The entire home range may not be visited daily. The movements may be restricted to only a small part of it. Think about all the places you go during the week, to school, to the store, to the park. All of these places are important to you. They are your home range. Every animal species needs a certain amount of space to survive and thrive. The amount of space an animal uses on a regular basis is called its home range. Home ranges can stretch for many miles, or they can be only a few feet. The size of a home range often depends on the size of an animal. Large animals, like the moose, need more space to survive than smaller animals like the chipmunk. A home range is a common property, whereas territory is a private property of an individual or family group of a species. Various theories have been proposed to explain territorial behavior. 1. Elastic disc. Flies Leucorhenia rubicunda maintains a territory along the edge of a pond. When the population density is relatively low, the individuals are spaced 3 to 7 meters apart. The aggressive interaction is frequent. When the density increases, the individuals are spaced less than 1/2 meter apart and the territoriality breaks down. This example supports the hypothesis that a territory is an elastic disc which can expand or squeeze depending on the size of the population. 2. Habitat suitability. Each individual will try to choose the optimum habitat where its chances of survival and the success of reproduction are highest. When the most suitable habitat is occupied, then the other remaining individuals occupy the suboptimum habitat. Thus, a habitat has its maximum suitability when the population density is 0. At low level of population density, only the optimum habitat is occupied. Further increase in density will result in spread of population over suboptimum, and so on. The unsettled may have to move out, emigration. Thus, territoriality spaces out individuals and restricts the number that occupies a suitable habitat. It is a potential population regulating mechanism. When the population density is high, the excluded males and females do not reproduce. The Arctic ground squirrel, Spermophilus undulates, all the females are allowed to nest, but the territorial polygamous males drive excessive males from the colony into the sub-marginal habitat where they exist as non-breeding floating population. The number of breeding males remains constant because the losses are continuously replaced by floating population dispersal. An increase in the population density and non-availability of suitable habitat is the major force in the dispersal of population. Dispersal is more pronounced under high population. 14. Densities, even though it is a continuous process and occurs even at low population density. Emigration is one-way movement out of the population without return. It decreases the population density. Immigration is the inward movement into a population. It increases the population density at a given place. Dispersal can be active or passive. In plants, mostly the dispersal is a passive phenomenon. The common examples are dispersal of seeds, fruits, eggs, and cysts. In animals, there is active dispersal. It may be for food, mate, or spawning. For example, birds have separate feeding and breeding grounds. Catadromous and anadromous fish migrate for spawning. Chitty S hypothesis figure 6 to explain population fluctuations in rodents. Similar effect is observed for food and space. Ref. Smith.